All right, we have briefly talked about macromolecules in class, and remember we said that macro means large, and so these are going to be large molecules. They're also considered organic molecules, the ones that we're going to be talking about anyway. So organic in the biological context doesn't mean what you think it means. It doesn't mean that it's like natural, because obviously they're natural. We're talking about biology. This actually means that it contains carbon. So all of the macromolecules, or all of the organic molecules that we're going to be talking about, contain carbon. So you know that for sure. The four major groups of macromolecules or organic molecules are carbohydrates, which I'm certain that you have heard of because you interact with them every day. You actually interact with all of these every day, but you see that word a lot. We have lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids. We're going to hold off on nucleic acids until we start talking about DNA and RNA and start getting into genetics. Right now, we're really going to focus more on carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, things that are more part of a diet, since we are working on our nutrition unit here. Something that you need to know is these large molecules have repeating units. And those are called polymers, polymer. So remember, you've got poly meaning many, and the mer is part. So it has many parts. And each part is it's called a single part, is a monomer. Is a single unit, or sometimes you might hear it's called a subunit, single unit or subunit. Okay, we're going to talk about all of the monomers and polymers for all of these macromolecules. So make sure that you are comfortable with those words right away. For the rest of this video, I'm only going to talk to you about carbohydrates. You'll need to go on to the next videos to learn about lipids and proteins. Okay, so let's look at carbohydrates. Carbohydrates, carbs for short, are sugars. Okay, that is the first thing that you should think of as soon as you hear carbohydrates. All carbohydrates are composed of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. So remember, all organic molecules have carbon, so carbohydrates are no exception. A sugar that everybody is really familiar with is glucose. We hear about that one all the time. It has a formula. Its formula is C6H12O6. This means that every single molecule of glucose has 6 carbons, 12 hydrogens, and 6 oxygens. However, all of those atoms have to be arranged in a very, very specific way to be considered glucose. So, in general, you might see carbohydrates represented as hexagons. Those are ones that have 6 carbons. Sometimes there's something called a 5-carbon sugar. They will be represented as pentagons. So this might be a single glucose. Okay, this might be a single sugar. Fructose is a 5-carbon sugar, but we'll look at examples in a minute. Okay, so sometimes you'll see that carbohydrates are represented as a chain. That's a terrible hexagon. That's not much better. But as a chain of hexagons. Okay, here you would have many, and this would just continue to go on. This would be many units. So this would be your polymer, and I'll give you the word for that for carbohydrates specifically. So let me erase some of this. The polymer name for carbohydrates is a polysaccharide. Now, poly means many. We already looked at that. Saccharide means sugar or sweet. So this literally means many sugars. So these are going to be very large molecules, and typically they're harder to break down, but they can store a lot of energy. And we'll talk about the functions of carbohydrates in just a second. The monomer for carbohydrates is called the monosaccharide. So mono means single or one, and again, saccharine is sugar. So this is a single sugar. Now, we didn't talk about the word dimer, but di means two, di, and the dimer for carbohydrates is a disaccharide. So notice, anytime you see saccharide, you're talking about carbohydrates. So disaccharide means it has two sugars. Okay, this is really just talking about the size and complexity of these molecules. But you need to know examples of each one of these. All right, monosaccharides include glucose, ribose, fructose, which you might be familiar with. If you eat a lot of fruit, that's a sugar found in fructose. Ribose is something that we'll see some more of in a future unit, but it is actually both of these are 5-carbon sugars, and glucose is a 6-carbon sugar. I'm so sorry, these are monosaccharides. I got myself mixed up here. Okay, so these are monosaccharides. Glucose, ribose, fructose, these are all monosaccharides. They are single sugars. Okay, fructose and ribose are 5-carbon sugars. Disaccharides consist of sucrose, which is something that you really do come in contact with all the time because this is table sugar. And maltose. That is actually, some liquors are made with maltose. There is also lactose, and hopefully you recognize that as milk sugar, or at least something having to do with milk. So the sugar that is found in milk is called lactose. Okay, now let's go back to the polysaccharides. Remember, these are monosaccharides. I messed up. Okay, so polysaccharides are going to be things like starch, cellulose, glycogen, chitin is also one. All right, and we're going to look at the functions of each of those specifically in just a minute because they are really rather important. I do want you to notice this ose ending. Glucose, ribose, fructose, sucrose, maltose, lactose, even cellulose. Ose means sugar. Anytime you see that ose ending, assume that this is going to be a carbohydrate that we're talking about. Okay, so now very quickly, let's look at the functions of carbohydrates. That is, after all, just the most important part, especially when we're talking about how they contribute to our body systems. So carbohydrates, and we're looking at functions, they are the primary source of energy. This is the first place that your body goes for energy. This is the quick energy. Think of a kid with a lollipop. As soon as he gets a lollipop, he's going to get super hyper because all of that sugar in that lollipop gets absorbed very quickly, and it's going to provide him with a lot of energy. Okay, it is also a structural component, so it can provide structure. The examples of those are cellulose, which is a major part of the plant cell wall, and chitin. Careful pronouncing that. I know it can get interesting. But chitin is a polysaccharide that is found in the exoskeleton. So remember, exo is outer. This is the outer skeleton of lobsters and cockroaches. I know that's very exciting too. This provides support for these organisms. And the plant cell wall, the cellulose in the plant cell wall also provides support. It provides rigidity, makes it firm. The final major function that we'll look at is storage. So sometimes we need to store glucose. In animals, the molecule that does that is glycogen. A lot of students confuse that with glucose. Be very careful with that. Glycogen is a network of glucose molecules, and it is stored in the liver of animals. So you have glycogen stores in your livers just in case you start running out of glucose and you need a quick source. Starch also has something similar. Plants also have something similar, but it is called starch. So this is glucose that is stored in plants. And you've heard of starch before. I'm sure you've heard that certain foods like grains, like rice and pasta, and some vegetables like potatoes are very starchy. They are plants, and that is how they store their glucose. In fact, when you wash potatoes, or if you have potatoes in water for a while, that water gets a little bit milky, turns a little white. That is from the starch that is coming out of the water, or out of the potato or pasta or whatever it is that you have in the water. So I know that was very fast. Feel free to pause, take notes, re-watch the video if you need to, and follow along in the skeleton notes. The next video will talk about lipids.